For them, he was just an easy target, a defenseless old baker, ready to pay for protection. But what these gangsters didn't know is that they were about to wake a nightmare. With a cold stare and a dark past, he revealed something that made the criminal's blood run cold. Who was this man? And why was he once the most feared assassin in the city? What happened next will leave you breathless. So, subscribe for more incredible stories and turn on notifications. The Golden Wheat Bakery stood on the busiest corner of Riverdale, like a bastion of aromas and traditions that resisted the passage of time. The pink limestone walls and reddish tiled roofs made it an integral part of the colonial landscape of that picturesque American town. Each morning, long before the sun painted the historic buildings orange, the lights in the shop were already on, and the unmistakable aroma of freshly baked bread wafted through the cobblestone streets. Frank Davidson, a 60-year-old man with a sturdy build, though somewhat stooped by age and hands toughened by work, was the soul of that place. His serene face, marked by deep wrinkles that revealed both smiles and past worries, reflected a life of constant effort. The always flower-stained apron and white cap were his daily uniform, almost a second skin he had adopted 15 years ago when he decided to settle in that corner of Vermont. "Good morning, Frank," greeted Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman who, every day without fail, arrived punctually at 6 in the morning to buy fresh rolls and vanilla conchas. "How did the best baker in Riverdale wake up today?" Frank responded with a kind smile while wrapping the bread in craft paper. "Well, Mrs. Thompson, with my hands in the dough since 3, as always." His voice was deep and measured, weighing each word as if measuring ingredients for his recipes. The bakery was more than a business. It was the meeting point where neighbors shared the day's news, where foreign tourists experienced authentic American charm, and where Frank had built a new and peaceful life. Nobody in town knew much about his past before arriving in Riverdale. They only knew that he came from El Paso and that he had learned the baker's trade from his grandfather. His reserved character and willingness to help anyone in need had earned him everyone's respect, without needing to delve into previous stories. "Did you see the news, Frank?" asked Robert, the owner of the hardware store across the street, while paying for his chocolate conchas. "They say those New Dawn guys are pressuring downtown merchants to pay security fees." The man made a quotation gesture with his fingers, evidencing the euphemism. Frank continued kneading while listening, his knuckles white from the pressure he exerted on the dough. "I heard something," he responded without looking up. "But Riverdale has always been peaceful. I don't think we'll have problems here." However, the expression in his eyes changed subtly, a shadow imperceptible to most but clear as water to anyone who knew how to read the warning signs in a man accustomed to hiding them. The bell on the door rang in the middle of the afternoon, when the bakery was almost empty. 3 men entered with the arrogance of those who believe they own the space they step into. The tallest, about 30 years old, wore a black silk shirt and sunglasses despite being indoors. The other 2, clearly subordinates, stayed near the door, watching the street and the interior alternately. "How can I help you?" asked Frank in a neutral tone, wiping his hands on his apron. The man in the black shirt smiled, showing a gold tooth. "I'm Eddie Carson, but my friends call me the Prince. We're offering a security service for Riverdale merchants." His accent revealed northern origins. "The town is changing, Mr. What's your name?" "Frank Davidson," replied the baker without flinching. "And Riverdale has always been safe without the need for additional services." The man called Eddie clicked his tongue, feigning disappointment. "Mr. Davidson, you don't understand. We're not asking your permission." He approached the counter and took a vanilla concha, taking a bite without paying. "It's more like a notice, $1,000 weekly, and your business won't have problems." Simple. Frank observed the man with a calmness that contrasted with the tension in the atmosphere. His eyes, normally kind, turned cold as ice. "I'm sorry, but you'll have to look elsewhere. We don't need that kind of protection here." Eddie's smile vanished. With an almost imperceptible gesture, one of his companions approached the display case and accidentally pushed it until it fell to the floor, shattering and scattering bread everywhere. "How clumsy of me," said the man with false innocence. "These accidents happen when one doesn't have..." adequate security. The three laughed while Eddie left a card on the counter. "We'll be back tomorrow, Mr. Davidson. Think about it, $1,000 is little for the peace of your business." They left as quickly as they had entered, leaving behind the broken glass and the heavy silence. Martha, the young woman who helped Frank in the afternoons, came out from the back room with a terrified expression. "Frank, what are we going to do? My cousin works in a craft store, and they went to threaten her." "Too?" Frank bent down to start, picking up the glass. "Don't worry, Martha, everything will be fine." His voice was calm, but something in his gaze had changed. "Close early today and go home. I'll take care of cleaning up." When Martha had left and the bakery was silent, Frank locked the door and lowered the blinds. With slow but determined steps, he went up the stairs to the small apartment he occupied above the bakery. From the room he used as a storage area, he extracted a wooden box hidden behind some flour sacks. The box, worn by time but well preserved, contained memories he had tried to bury in the deepest part of his memory. Old photographs, yellowed, newspaper clippings, and wrapped in a black velvet cloth, a semi-automatic pistol. Frank took the oldest photo. In it, a younger man, in military uniform of the U.S. Special Forces, looked at the camera with a serious expression. Next to him, several companions posed in front of a helicopter. He turned the photograph over where a faded inscription read, "Jaguar Squad, Operation Northern Border, 1998. "I thought I would never have to be that man again," he murmured to himself as he ran his fingers over the cold metal of the weapon. That night, while Riverdale slept under a blanket of stars, Frank Davidson didn't need bread. Instead, he crafted a meticulous plan, remembering tactics and strategies from a past he had tried to leave behind when he decided to become a baker and start a new life away from the chaos. At dawn, when the first rays of the sun filtered through the bakery windows, Frank had already made a decision. There would be no fresh bread that day at Golden Wheat. For the first time in 15 years, the bakery would remain closed. In its place, Frank Davidson, the quiet baker of Riverdale, had arranged everything for a meeting that would change the course of his life and that of the entire town. Eddie Carson and his men would arrive expecting to find a frightened man, willing to pay for protection. Instead, they would discover that some people are not what they appear, and that behind the flour dust and the smell of freshly baked bread, a past could be hidden that was better not to have awakened. The next morning, Eddie Carson and his two companions walked down the cobblestone streets of Riverdale with the confidence of those who believe themselves untouchable. The neighbors looked at them out of the corner of their eye, averting their gaze when they passed, fearful of attracting their attention. The group stopped in front of Golden Wheat, surprised to find the door closed and a sign announcing, "Closed for inventory. Reopening tomorrow." "What did I tell you, Prince?" commented one of the men mockingly. "The old man is scared. Surely when we come back, he'll have the money ready." Eddie narrowed his eyes, scrutinizing the facade of the business. Something didn't fit. "Carlos, go round back and see if there's any rear entrance. Javier, stay here watching. I'm going in." With the arrogance of one who knows no limits, Eddie skillfully forced the lock and entered the bakery. The silence inside was absolute. No ovens on, no characteristic aroma of freshly made bread, just an unsettling dimness and the empty counter. "Mr. Davidson?" he called, advancing cautiously. "I just want to talk business. There's no need to hide." Suddenly, the door closed behind him with a dry thud. Eddie turned abruptly, but before he could react, the lights came on, revealing Frank Davidson standing next to the switch. But it wasn't the same stooped and serene man from the day before. His posture had changed. Now he stood completely upright, shoulders straight, and with a presence that filled the room. His eyes, normally warm, showed a calculating coldness. "Good morning, Mr. Carson," greeted Frank with a firm and controlled voice. "I'm glad you came. We have much to discuss." Eddie tried to maintain his composure, but something in the baker's new attitude disconcerted him. "Where are my men?" "Your friends are unoccupied for the moment," replied Frank calmly. "It will give us time to talk without interruptions." Eddie instinctively brought his hand to his waist, where he had a concealed pistol, but stopped when He saw Frank gently shaking his head. Don't make that mistake, Carson. You came here thinking you were extorting a simple baker. Frank took a few steps forward. You forgot to do your homework. You forgot to ask who I was before I needed bread. The younger man let out a nervous laugh. And who are you supposed to be, old man? An ex-cop who thinks he can scare me? Frank smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. Commander Frank Davidson, Special Forces Jaguar Squad, specialist in counter-terrorism and covert operations on the northern border. His voice took on a deeper tone. But that was a long time ago. Now I just want to bake my bread in peace. Eddie's expression changed. The name of the Jaguar Squad was legendary in certain circles, an elite unit that had dismantled numerous criminal operations in the late 90s. You're lying, he stammered, though doubt was reflected in his voice. I could show you my medals, but I left them behind when I came to Riverdale. What I haven't forgotten are my skills. Frank moved closer, with fluid movements that contrasted with the image of the 60-year-old baker. Now we have two options. You and your group leave Riverdale and never bother any merchant again, or I will be forced to remember old times. Eddie, regaining some of his arrogance, finally pulled out his pistol, pointing directly at Frank's chest. I think you're confused, Grandpa. I'm the one giving orders here. In a movement so fast that he could barely follow it with his eyes, Frank diverted the weapon, tore it from his hands, and disassembled the pistol with mechanical precision, leaving the pieces on the counter. As I said, we have options, repeated Frank as if nothing had happened. Eddie stepped back, his face now pale. What did you do with my men? Nothing they don't deserve. They're alive, if that's what concerns you. Just a little indisposed. Frank took out a cell phone and showed an image. The two men appeared tied up in what looked like a basement. They have water and food. They'll be fine until we finish our conversation. Eddie's confidence was crumbling by the moment. This was not the frightened old man he expected to find. What do you want from me? He finally asked. I want information. Who's behind New Dawn? How many are there and where do they meet? Frank leaned on the counter, with the calm of someone who has all the time in the world. Eddie let out a bitter laugh. If I tell you that, I'm a finished man. If you don't tell me, you are too, replied Frank without altering his tone. The difference is that in the first case, you leave Riverdale with your men and start over somewhere else. In the second, he left the sentence unfinished, but the message was clear. After a few moments of tense silence, Eddie spoke. We are 12. We operate from an abandoned ranch outside town, near the road to Oak Ridge. He paused as if debating internally. The boss is Richard Martin, ex-military, like you. He says businesses are more lucrative in the private sector. Frank nodded, slowly. Richard Martin, he murmured as if recognizing the name. Lieutenant Martin from the 7th Battalion? His eyes narrowed. Interesting. You know him? Asked Eddie, surprised. We served together briefly. Frank stood up, making a decision. This is what's going to happen, Carson. You're going to take me to that ranch tonight. We're going to have a conversation with your boss, and depending on how that conversation turns out, you can all continue with your lives somewhere else. Martin has armed guards, warned Eddie. He's not an easy man to surprise. Neither was I, replied Frank with a smile that revealed experience and determination. Meanwhile, in other parts of Riverdale, rumors began to circulate. Merchants whispered about strange disappearances of members of the extortion group. Some said they had seen Frank the baker, moving around town with unexpected agility, visiting businesses and speaking in low voices with the owners. In the main square, Martha met with Robert, the hardware store owner, both concerned about Frank's absence from the bakery. Do you think something bad happened to him? Asked Martha, nervously twisting her apron. Those men seem dangerous. Robert shook his head. I don't know what's going on, but this morning I saw Frank talking to Captain Wilson of the municipal police. They seemed like old friends. With Captain Wilson? Martha seemed confused. Frank always said he barely knew the local authorities. Well, they were patting each other on the back like lifelong comrades, insisted Robert. And I heard something about the old squad and like in the old days. All very strange. As the sun began to set over the domes and towers of Riverdale, Frank Davidson prepared for a night that would determine the future of the community he had come to consider his home. In the small apartment above the bakery, he spread out on the table a map of the surroundings of the town, marking routes and strategic points. The phone rang, startling him slightly. When he answered, a deep and familiar voice spoke from the other end. Call Jaguar 1, this is Black Eagle. I received your message. Is it true that the lieutenant is involved? Confirmed, Captain Wilson. Lieutenant Martin is running the operation. Frank spoke in a professional tone that contrasted with his usual measured cadence. I'll need backup, but discreet. Nothing official yet. Understood. The boys and I will be in position at 2200 hours, like in Tucson 2001. Like in Tucson, confirmed Frank. Out. When he hung up, his eyes fell on a framed photograph on the dresser. A younger Frank in dress uniform, receiving a medal from a general. The image seemed to belong to another life, to another man. However, that night, Commander Davidson would rise again from the ashes of his past, not to end enemies, but to protect the peaceful future that had cost him so much to build. Eddie Carson was waiting in a dark car 2 streets from the bakery, as they had agreed. His face showed a mixture of fear and resignation. When Frank got into the vehicle, he barely recognized him. The stooped baker had completely disappeared, replaced by a man with an upright posture, penetrating gaze, and precise movements, dressed completely in black. Let's go, ordered Frank in a voice that allowed no reply. And remember, Carson, your cooperation will determine your future. Choose wisely. The car moved away from Riverdale, venturing into the night toward the abandoned ranch, as the moon illuminated the fields that surrounded the road. In the distance, several figures moved among the shadows following the vehicle. The Jaguar squad was gathering again for a final mission, led by a man who had found peace among flour and sugar, but who had not forgotten how to protect what he loved. The St. Christopher Ranch rose imposingly under the starry Vermont sky. Once it had been a prosperous property producing maple syrup, with extensive fields of maple trees and a production facility that made one of the best syrups in the region. Now, its weathered stone walls eroded by time, and its partially collapsed roofs told a story of abandonment and decay. However, the lights filtering through some windows and the occasional movement of shadows revealed that the place was far from uninhabited. Eddie drove in silence, casting nervous glances at Frank every few minutes. As they approached the main entrance, flanked by 2 enormous columns crowned with stone eagles, he slowed down. There are guards at the entrance and also patrols around the perimeter, he murmured, discreetly pointing toward armed men guarding the gate. Martin is paranoid about security, Frank observed attentively, his eyes scrutinizing every detail of the terrain. Keep driving as if nothing is happening, he ordered. Pass the main entrance and continue on the side road that circles the property. Eddie obeyed, and the vehicle passed in front of the guards, who barely paid attention to it as they recognized the car. About 300 meters ahead, Frank indicated that he should stop next to a dense thicket of cacti and bushes. Now you're going to tell me exactly how many men are inside, where Martin is, and what the guard's routine is, demanded Frank, his voice calm but inflexible. Over the next few minutes, Eddie described in detail the layout of the ranch, the security shifts, and the weak points in security. Frank listened attentively, occasionally making notes in a small notebook. Martin, Claire's always in the study at the end of the main hallway, concluded Eddie. He has 2 personal bodyguards who never leave his side, ex-military too, I think. Frank put away the notebook and took out his phone. He dialed a number and spoke briefly. Black Eagle, this is Jaguar 1. Position confirmed, starting in 30 minutes. Maintain distance until the signal. Upon finishing the call, he looked directly at Eddie. Now you have a decision to make, Carson. You can help me get in and talk to Martin, or you can stay in the car. But I warn you, if you choose the second option and then decide to betray me, the consequences will be unpleasant. Eddie swallowed. I'll take you to Martin, but let it be noted that I'm doing this under coercion. Frank smiled slightly. Noted, let's go then. They left the vehicle hidden among the vegetation and approached the ranch on foot. Eddie explained that there was a poorly guarded service entrance they used to receive supplies. Upon arrival, they indeed found only one guard, who immediately recognized Eddie. "What are you doing here so late, Prince?" asked the man, curious but not alarmed. "And who's the old man?" "New recruit," responded Eddie with a naturalness that surprised even Frank. "He has important information for the boss about the Riverdale merchants." The guard nodded and allowed them to pass without further questions. Once inside, they advanced through poorly lit corridors. The ranch was a labyrinth of interconnected rooms, interior patios and narrow hallways. Eddie guided the way with the familiarity of someone who knows the terrain well. "The study is at the end of that hallway," he whispered, pointing toward a carved wooden door at the end of a corridor. "There are always two men outside." Frank nodded. "Wait here," he ordered, and before Eddie could protest, the ex-commander was already advancing down the hallway with absolute confidence. The two guards next to the study door tensed upon seeing him approach. One of them brought his hand to his weapon but stopped upon noticing that the approaching man was an unarmed old man. "Who are you?" demanded one of them, blocking the way. "An old friend of Lieutenant Martin," responded Frank with a serene voice. "Tell him that Commander Davidson has come to say hello after so many years." The guards exchanged confused looks. One of them briefly entered the study to convey the message. When he returned, his attitude had completely changed. "You may pass, sir," he said with sudden respect. "The boss is waiting for you." The study was a spacious and luxurious room that contrasted with the general state of the ranch. Illuminated by a large crystal chandelier, its walls were covered with bookshelves and framed maps. In the center, a mahogany desk dominated the space, and behind it a man of about 55, with perfectly groomed silver hair and an impeccable suit, observed Frank with a mixture of surprise and caution. "Commander Davidson," greeted Richard Martin, rising slowly. "Or should I say Baker Davidson? You've really surprised me. I thought you were retired on some beach in Florida, not baking bread in Riverdale." "Life takes many turns, Lieutenant," responded Frank, advancing until he stood in front of the desk. He noticed that Martin carried a pistol in a shoulder holster, barely visible under his jacket. "I see you've prospered since our days in the army." Martin made an ambiguous gesture with his hand. "Private businesses are more lucrative than service to the country, Commander, something you never understood." He pointed to a chair in front of his desk. "Please sit down. A whiskey? Or do you prefer something more in line with your new profession, perhaps a glass of milk?" he added mockingly. Frank ignored the taunt and took a seat. "I haven't come to reminisce about old times, Richard. I've come to propose a deal." "A deal?" Martin let out a laugh. "The legendary Commander Jaguar wants to negotiate with an extortionist? The years have softened you, Frank." "On the contrary," replied Frank, leaning slightly forward. "They've given me perspective. That's why I'm here talking to you instead of having come in with the entire Jaguar squad." Martin's smile froze. "The Jaguar squad? That's ancient history." "Not as ancient as you think. Captain Wilson is still in service, now in the Riverdale Municipal Police, and it turns out that several of our old companions retired in this area." Frank made a calculated pause. "They're outside, Richard, surrounding the ranch as we speak." Martin maintained his composure, but a nervous tick in his eye betrayed his unease. "And what exactly do you propose, Commander?" "Simple. You leave Riverdale in peace. Neither you nor your men return to approach the merchants, and everyone can continue with their lives." Frank reclined in his chair. "Or we can resolve this like in the old days, and you know well how our operations ended." Martin observed his former superior carefully. The legendary Commander Davidson had been both feared and respected, known for his unwavering loyalty and his relentless tactics against those who threatened national security. "Why do you care so much about that little town, Frank? You have the skills to live like a king anywhere." "Because I found peace," responded Frank with simplicity, "something you never understood. You were always brilliant, Richard, but you never knew when it was enough." Martin remained silent, evaluating his options. Finally, he sighed and opened a drawer in his desk. Frank tensed, but Martin only extracted a bottle of aged bourbon and 2 glasses. "Remember Tucson 2001? He asked while serving the liquor. "The operation where we almost got trapped in that warehouse." Frank nodded. 10 to 1. We barely got out. And we made it because we followed your plan. Martin slid a glass toward Frank. "You were the best strategist the Army has ever had, Frank. That's why I never understood why you retired so abruptly." "I had my reasons," responded Frank, taking the glass but not drinking. "The question is, are you going to accept my proposal? You can take your operation elsewhere, away from Riverdale." Martin drank his bourbon in one gulp and then looked directly at Frank. His eyes reflected an internal battle. "What if I told you there's more at stake than simple extortions? What if I told you that Riverdale is just the beginning of something much bigger?" Frank narrowed his eyes. "Explain yourself." "The government is about to announce a massive tourism project in the region, millions of dollars in investments, land that will multiply in value." Martin smiled bitterly. "I have important investors backing me, Frank. People with influence who want to control who gets what piece of the pie. The merchants are just the beginning, a way to establish our territory." "You were always ambitious," commented Frank, shaking his head. "But this goes beyond ambition. It's pragmatism. The world has changed." Martin leaned forward. "Join me, Commander. With your experience and my contacts, we could control the entire region. I'm offering you a part of the business, much more lucrative than baking bread for the rest of your life." Frank looked at his bourbon, thoughtful. Then, with a deliberate movement, he took a sip and left the glass on the desk. "You're wrong about something fundamental, Richard. You never understood why we fought. It wasn't for power or money. It was to protect the innocent." Martin's face hardened, noble as always. "But idealists like you end up forgotten in history, while practical men like me build empires." "I prefer to be forgotten in peace than remembered for the harm caused," responded Frank, standing up. "My offer still stands. Leave Riverdale or face me and the Jaguar Squad." Martin also stood up, his hand instinctively moving toward the pistol under his jacket. "Do you really think a few retired old military men can stop us? I have armed men all over the ranch." "And I have this," responded Frank, taking from his pocket a small black device that Martin immediately recognized. A military detonator. "Old. Habits never die, Lieutenant. While we were talking, my men have been placing non-lethal explosives at strategic points around your ranch. Tear gas mainly, enough to incapacitate all your guards simultaneously." Martin's face paled. "You wouldn't dare." "Let's test your theory," challenged Frank with his thumb on the detonator button. At that moment, the door burst open, and Eddie entered precipitously. "Boss, we're surrounded. The municipal police, federal agents. There are dozens of them. Outside." Martin looked incredulously at Eddie and then at Frank. "What have you done, you old fox?" "Plan B," responded Frank simply. "If diplomacy failed, I could always resort to old favors. Commissioner Moore, remember him? He was part of our support team in Arizona. Now he directs the state police, and he's very interested in your private businesses." The reality of his situation settled on Martin's face like a dark shadow. He was cornered, betrayed by someone he had severely underestimated. The tension in the study of St. Christopher Ranch could be cut with a knife. Richard Martin, the man who had sown fear in Riverdale for months, looked out the window in disbelief. Indeed, official vehicles and uniformed men surrounded the property, their flashing lights tinting the night with blue and red flashes. "You were always meticulous in your operations, Frank," Martin finally said, moving away from the window. His voice had lost its arrogant tone, replaced by a bitter resignation. "But this is a betrayal of your former brother-in-arms." Frank shook his head. "The real betrayal was yours, Richard, using your military skills to terrorize innocent civilians. Everything we learned, everything we fought for, you've perverted it out of greed. And you, haven't you betrayed your skills by hiding behind a mediocre life, kneading bread like a simple artisan?" replied Martin, trying to recover some of his wounded dignity. Frank smiled slightly. "There's more honor in creating something that nourishes and brings joy to people than in destroying their lives out of ambition." He approached the window and observed the police operation. You have two options: surrender peacefully or resist. I recommend the first. There are too many witnesses for this to end any other way. Eddie Carson, who had remained silent near the door, observed the exchange between the two ex-military men with nervousness. "What will happen to us, to those who worked for Martin?" he finally asked, his voice betraying his fear. "That will depend on your cooperation," responded Frank without taking his eyes off Martin. "You've already taken the first step, Eddie. You've chosen wisely." Martin let out a bitter laugh. "You've promised immunity to this traitor. Typical of you, always believing in second chances. The difference between you and me, Richard, is that I never lost sight of why we joined the army in the first place. To protect, not to abuse." Frank turned to Eddie. "Go outside and tell Captain Wilson that everything is under control. Martin will surrender without resistance." Eddie nodded and quickly left, visibly relieved to get away from the tension in the study. Once alone, Martin collapsed in his chair, suddenly aged and defeated. "Do you know why I left the army, Frank? Because I got tired of risking my life for a country that doesn't value its soldiers. 20 years of service, and what did I get? A miserable pension and a thank you for your service." "We all went through that disillusionment," responded Frank, sitting across from him. "But becoming. What we fought against wasn't the answer. And baking bread was." Martin's tone was sarcastic, but without real energy. Frank smiled with genuine tranquility. "For me, yes. I found peace in the simple things, in creating something with my hands, in being part of a community." He made a reflective pause. "Remember the operation in Colorado, when we rescued that town from drug traffickers? Remember how they received us afterward with homemade food and gratitude?" Martin nodded slowly, a flash of remembrance momentarily softening his expression. "That feeling, that purpose, I find it every day in my bakery, when mothers come with their children for sweet bread, when the elderly tell me their stories over the counter." Frank leaned forward. "I found another way to serve, Richard. Without violence, without fear." A long silence extended between them, loaded with decades of shared stories and divergent paths. Finally, Martin slowly took out his pistol and placed it on the desk, sliding it toward Frank. "You were always the best of us," he admitted. "Maybe if I had listened more to your advice in those days." Frank took the weapon and put it away. "It's never too late to change direction, Lieutenant." "For me it is," responded Martin, standing up with renewed dignity. "Let's end this." Together, they left the study where several police officers were waiting for them. Captain Wilson, a robust man of about 50, greeted Frank with the respect of a former subordinate to his commander. "Everything under control, Commander Davidson?" he asked formally. "Affirmative, Captain. Mr. Martin will fully cooperate in the investigation of the activities of the New Dawn group." Frank handed the pistol to Wilson. "Make sure he is treated with the respect that corresponds to a former military man, regardless of his recent actions." While the officers escorted Martin toward one of the vehicles, he briefly stopped next to Frank. "One last question, Frank. How did you know it was me behind all this?" "The modus operandi," responded Frank simply. "The organizational structure, the discipline of your men, too military to be coincidence. And then that name, New Dawn. It was the code for our last mission together." Martin nodded with a resigned smile, always attentive to details. Then he added in a lower voice, "Be careful, old friend. The people I work for are not as honorable as you. This might not be over yet." Before Frank could respond, Martin was led to the police car and the door closed behind him. Captain Wilson approached Frank with a concerned expression. "Should we take that warning seriously, Commander?" "Always," responded Frank. "Richard was never one for empty threats. If he says there's someone else involved, we should investigate." "What do we do with the others?" Wilson pointed toward E. "Several of Martin's men who are being detained in the main patio of the ranch. Interrogate them carefully. Many probably just followed orders without really understanding what they were involved in." Frank observed Eddie, who was waiting nervously next to an officer. "Especially that one. He has collaborated and deserves some consideration." The operation continued for hours. The police found incriminating documents, lists of extorted merchants and, more significantly, detailed plans to expand the operation to other tourist cities in Vermont. But the most revealing was a series of correspondences between Martin and several state government officials, suggesting a network of corruption much wider than they had initially suspected. As they reviewed the documents, Captain Wilson whistled in amazement. "This goes beyond simple extortion, Commander. There are important names here." Frank nodded gravely. That's why Martin was so confident. He had protection from above. "What do we do with this information?" Wilson held a folder full of compromising photographs and signed documents. "We get it directly to the governor and the press," responded Frank without hesitation. "If there's corruption in high places, the best protection is transparency." When they finally left the ranch, the sky was beginning to lighten on the horizon. Frank felt exhausted but satisfied. The immediate threat to Riverdale had been neutralized, although Martin's words of warning continued to resonate in his mind. The road back to Riverdale passed in relative silence. Eddie, now under protective custody, looked out the window with a thoughtful expression. "What will happen to me now?" he finally asked. "You'll testify against Martin and his associates," responded Frank. "In exchange, you'll receive a reduced sentence. Afterward, you'll have the opportunity to rebuild your life." "Like you did?" Eddie looked at him with genuine curiosity. Frank smiled. "Everyone finds their own path. Mine was bread. Maybe yours will be something else." Upon arriving in Riverdale, the news had already spread like wildfire. The merchants gathered in small groups, discussing the events of the previous night. When Frank entered the main square, several pointed at him and spontaneously applauded. The modest baker had become, overnight, the unexpected hero of the town. Martha ran to him, hugging him tightly. "Frank, we were so worried. They say you alone faced that entire gang of extortionists." "Don't exaggerate," responded Frank, uncomfortable with the attention. "I just did what anyone would have done to protect their community." "Anyone?" intervened Robert, the hardware store owner, approaching with a smile. "Would anyone have dismantled?" "A gang of criminals using military tactics? I think you owe us some explanations, Commander Davidson." Frank sighed. His carefully constructed life as a simple baker had ended. Now all of Riverdale knew that behind the flour-stained apron hid a much more complex past. "I'll tell you everything," he promised, "but first, I need to open my bakery. There's bread that needs to be baked." The crowd laughed, but they let him go. They understood instinctively that this extraordinary man found comfort in the ordinary, in the familiar routine of kneading, baking, and serving his community. As Frank walked toward Golden Wheat, he noticed a black car with tinted windows, parked near his bakery. For an instant, his body returned to the alertness of the trained soldier, but the vehicle started and drove away before he could approach it. Martin's words resonated again in his mind. "The people I work for are not as honorable as you." This might not be over yet. With renewed caution, Frank opened his bakery, turned on the ovens, and put on his apron. As he prepared the dough for the day's bread, his mind worked on a strategy to face any future threat. Commander Davidson of the Jaguar Squad had never really ceased to exist. He had simply integrated into the baker of Riverdale, creating a man who could both nourish and protect those around him. And if the shadows of Martin's past came for him, they would be making the same mistake that Eddie and his men had made, underestimating a man who had found in peace his greatest strength. 3 weeks after the capture of Richard Martin, Riverdale had recovered much of its usual tranquility. Tourists strolled carefree through its cobblestone streets, local artists exhibited their works in the main square, and merchants returned to work without the fear of receiving unwanted visits. At Golden Wheat, Frank Davidson kneaded bread from the early hours of the morning, as he had always done. However, something had changed. He was no longer simply Frank, the baker. Now customers looked at him with a mixture of respect and curiosity, aware that those hands that shaped rolls and conchas had also been capable of dismantling a criminal organization. "Good morning, Commander," greeted Mrs. Thompson with a mischievous smile, deliberately using Frank's former military rank. How is our local hero this morning? Frank responded with a resigned smile as he handed her her usual bread. I'm just a baker, Mrs. Thompson. Commander Davidson retired many years ago. Well, for being retired, you still have very good reflexes, commented the elderly woman, winking at him before leaving. Martha, who now knew her boss's whole story, worked at his side with renewed enthusiasm. She had confessed that her grandfather had also been in the military, and that somehow she had always felt that Frank had something special that she couldn't explain. Frank, called the young woman while organizing the breads in the display. Case, there's someone who wants to see you. He says it's important. Frank looked up to find a middle-aged man in an impeccable suit and leather briefcase. He didn't recognize him, but his posture and the way he quickly scanned the bakery betrayed training similar to his own. Commander Davidson, the man greeted, extending his hand. I'm James Reynolds from the Attorney General's office. Could we speak in private? After cleaning the flour from his hands, Frank led the visitor to the small office behind the counter. Martha brought them freshly made coffee and closed the door as she left. The case against Martin and his organization is progressing well, Reynolds began, pulling some documents from his briefcase. Your statements and the evidence found at the ranch have been fundamental. However, there are recent developments that should interest you. What kind of developments? Asked Frank, his military instinct immediately alert. Martin wasn't the real head of the operation, explained Reynolds, spreading a series of photographs on the desk. He was just an executor, someone with the necessary skills to implement a much more ambitious plan. The photographs showed Martin in meetings with various individuals, including some government officials that Frank recognized from the newspapers. The real mastermind behind all. This is this man, continued Reynolds, pointing to an elegant gentleman in his 60s who appeared in several of the images. Gabriel Winters, real estate businessman with political connections throughout the country. Frank studied the photograph carefully. What does a real estate businessman have to do with extorting merchants in Riverdale? Everything, replied Reynolds gravely. As Martin told you, there's a massive tourism project planned for this area. Luxury hotels, shopping malls, residential complexes. But for that, they need strategic land, much of which is occupied by small family businesses. And extortion was the first step to force them to sell, deduced Frank, finally understanding the magnitude of the plan. Exactly. First, they demand payments impossible to maintain. Then they generously offer to buy their properties as a solution to their economic problems. Reynolds took a sip of coffee. It's a tactic that Winters has employed in other parts of the country, always using intermediaries who take all the blame if something goes wrong. Like Martin, murmured Frank. Precisely. And here comes the part that directly concerns you, Commander. Reynolds leaned forward. Winters isn't happy with your intervention. He's lost millions in potential investments, and worse, he's exposed. Several of his political allies are being investigated thanks to the documents we found. Are you telling me I'm in danger? Asked Frank calmly, as if discussing the weather. I'm telling you that Winters isn't someone who forgets those who interfere with his plans. Reynolds extracted an envelope from his briefcase. That's why I'm here. We need your testimony to strengthen the case against him. And for your safety, we're offering you official protection until the trial concludes. Frank took the envelope but didn't open it. His mind was quickly evaluating options, scenarios, risks. After a long moment, he shook his head. I'll testify. Of course, but I don't need protection. Riverdale is my home and I'm not going to hide. With all due respect, Commander, Winters isn't like the criminals you faced in the past. He has resources, contacts, people willing to do the dirty work for him. And I have my former Jaguar squad companions, replied Frank with a serene smile. Besides, I know every corner of this town. If Winters wants to come for me, let him. Try, he'll be on my territory. Reynolds seemed to want to insist, but something in Frank's gaze made him desist. I understand. At least accept this, he said, sliding a card with his phone number. Any suspicious movement, call me immediately. After Reynolds left, Frank remained in his office, contemplating the photographs the prosecutor had left. Gabriel. Winters had the appearance of a respectable businessman, but his eyes revealed a calculating coldness that Frank had seen many times in formidable enemies. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Martha with a worried expression. "Everything okay, Frank?" "Yes, Martha, just pending matters from the Martin case." Frank collected the photographs and put them in a drawer. "How's the Day of the Dead bread you were preparing?" "Almost. Ready for the oven," she replied, relieved to return to everyday topics. "By the way, Captain Wilson called. He said he'll come this afternoon to talk to you." Frank nodded, silently thanking the loyalty of his former brothers-in-arms. The Jaguar squad was gathering again, this time not for a military operation, but to protect one of their own. That afternoon, after closing the bakery, Frank received not only Captain Wilson, but 5 more ex-military men, all members of the legendary squad. Men who, like him, had found civilian lives after service: a schoolteacher, a veterinarian, a taxi driver, a mechanic, and a farmer. Different paths, but the same discipline and unwavering loyalty. "So Winters is behind it all," summarized Wilson, after Frank explained the situation. "I've heard of him. He has properties all over the country, always acquired in questionable ways. And now he has his sights set on Riverdale," added Frank. "And apparently on me." "Well, he'll have to go through all of us," firmly declared Sam Green, the schoolteacher, who had once been the most accurate sniper in the squad. The Jaguars protect their own. During the next few hours, the 6 veterans developed a security plan that combined constant vigilance with their normal civilian routines. No one observing them would suspect that these ordinary men formed a protection system more effective than any professional bodyguard. Meanwhile, in New York City, Gabriel Winters was receiving the report from his head of security in the luxurious office on the top floor of a corporate skyscraper. "Davidson has rejected official protection," reported the man in a black suit. "He continues with his normal routine at the bakery." "A mistake he will regret," commented Winters, contemplating the panoramic view of the city from his window. "What do we know about his close circle?" "He lives alone, no known family in Riverdale. His only employee is a local young woman, Martha Stevens. His most frequent contacts are ex-military living in the area, all former members of his unit." Winters frowned. "The infamous Jaguar squad." He took a sip of his Scottish whiskey. "I've heard stories about them. An elite group that carried out covert operations on the northern border." He reflected for a moment. "This complicates things. We're not dealing with a simple stubborn baker." "We could use other, less direct methods," suggested the head of security. "Economic pressure, offering him a considerable sum for his property." "No," Winters cut him off dryly. "Davidson has already demonstrated that he's not susceptible to those kinds of tactics. We need to be more creative." In the following days, a series of minor incidents began to occur in Riverdale. A mysterious health inspection appeared at Golden Wheat, alleging anonymous complaints. Frank's business license was suddenly questioned for administrative irregularities. A local newspaper published an article suggesting connections between the hero baker and controversial former military operations. They were subtle but effective attacks designed to undermine Frank's reputation and pressure him without resorting to direct violence. Winters' strategy was clear: isolate Davidson from the community that had welcomed him, turn him into a pariah, force him to leave of his own accord. However, the businessman had underestimated Riverdale's response. Far from abandoning Frank, the neighbors united in his defense. When the health inspectors arrived, they found dozens of customers willing to attest to the bakery's impeccable cleanliness. When they questioned his license, the mayor himself intervened, publicly reminding everyone that Golden Wheat was a cultural heritage of the town. And when the defamatory article appeared, the inhabitants flooded the newspaper with letters defending their baker. In response to this unexpected resistance, Winters decided to increase the pressure. One morning, Frank found the door of his bakery vandalized with a clear message: "Leave or face the consequences." Instead of being intimidated, Frank simply cleaned the door and opened his business as every day. But internally, he knew the situation was escalating toward an inevitable confrontation. That same afternoon, as he was closing the bakery, Frank noticed a black vehicle parked across the street, the same one he had seen weeks earlier. This time, however, it didn't leave when he looked at it. Instead, the window lowered slightly, enough for Frank to distinguish the metallic gleam of what appeared to be a weapon. With the calm of someone who has faced death many times, Frank finished closing up, pretending not to have noticed anything unusual. But instead of heading to his apartment on the upper floor, he left through the back door and disappeared into the labyrinth of alleys he knew better than anyone. Minutes later, Captain Wilson received a cryptic call. Jaguar 1 to Black Eagle. Phase 2 initiated. For the next 24 hours, Riverdale experienced a series of subtle but coordinated movements. The veterinarian closed his clinic early. The school teacher requested a day of leave. The taxi driver left his vehicle at the workshop. The mechanic hung a closed for inventory sign. The farmer left his field in the care of his children. And at the municipal police station, Captain Wilson informed his superiors that he would take a day off for family matters. The Jaguar squad had mobilized. Meanwhile, Gabriel Winters was landing at the small private airport on the outskirts of Riverdale. Against the recommendations of his security team, he had decided to personally supervise the operation against Davidson. This matter had become personal, a test of wills between two men accustomed to winning. "Everything is ready, sir," reported his head of security. 4 teams positioned around the bakery and the apartment. "If Davidson tries anything, we'll know immediately." Winters nodded, pleased. "Excellent. I don't want unnecessary violence, just a persuasive conversation. Commander Davidson needs to understand that there are battles he cannot win." What Winters ignored was that, as he spoke, each of his teams was being silently neutralized, not with violence but with the surgical precision of veterans trained in covert operations. Winters' men simply disappeared from their positions, replaced by members of the Jaguar squad, who assumed their identities in radio communications. When Winters arrived at the main square of Riverdale, convinced that he had total control of the situation, he found a scenario completely different from what he expected. Instead of a covert operation, he was walking into a meticulously prepared trap. Upon entering Golden Wheat, which inexplicably was open despite the late hour, he found Frank Davidson calmly kneading bread as if he had been expecting him. "Mr. Winters," greeted Frank without leaving his work. "You arrived just in time to try the conchas fresh from the oven. Do you prefer vanilla or chocolate?" Disconcerted by this unexpected reception, Winters tried to regain control of the situation. "Commander Davidson, I see you know my name." "Just as you know mine," replied Frank, offering him a napkin with a vanilla concha. "Please sit down, we have much to discuss." Wary but intrigued, Winters took a seat at one of the tables. It was then that he noticed they weren't alone. In every corner of the bakery there was a man, apparently ordinary customers, but whose attentive eyes revealed a very different reality. "Where are my men?" asked Winters, finally understanding the situation. "Safe," replied Frank, sitting across from him. "Unlike you, we don't resolve conflicts with violence, not when there are more civilized alternatives." Winters quickly evaluated his options, realizing that he was completely at the mercy of Frank and his men. "What do you want, Commander?" "The same thing you do, a prosperous future for Riverdale," replied Frank, with surprising sincerity. "The difference is that my vision includes the current inhabitants and merchants, not just foreign investors and luxury hotels." Over the next hour, Frank presented Winters with a detailed proposal, an alternative development plan that would allow the modernization of Riverdale without destroying its essence or displacing its traditional inhabitants. A plan he had developed with help from local architects, economists, and community leaders. "Your mistake, Mr. Winters, was thinking there's only one path to progress," concluded Frank, "and that path requires destroying what already exists. I'm offering you an alternative where everyone wins." Winters studied the documents with genuine professional interest. Despite the situation, he couldn't deny that the proposal had merit. "And if I refuse? Then all the documents that prove your land acquisition methods, your connections with corrupt officials, and your intimidation tactics will simultaneously reach the Attorney General's office, the national and international press, and your business competitors," replied Frank with the same calm with which he would explain a bread recipe. "Your empire would crumble in a matter of weeks." The silence that followed was long and tense. Finally, Winters let out a short, bitter laugh. "You know, Commander, under other circumstances, I would have hired you. You have a strategic mind. To that I admire. And under other circumstances, perhaps I would have accepted," replied Frank, "but I chose to bake bread." When Gabriel Winters left Riverdale that night, he did so with a signed agreement and a new perspective. Commander Davidson had not only defeated him tactically, he had offered him a lesson on alternative ways of doing business, where success wasn't measured solely in financial gains. In the months that followed, Riverdale experienced gradual but significant changes. New investments flowed into the town, but respecting its historical character and the local economy. Small merchants, far from being displaced, became an integral part of the area's tourist appeal. Golden Wheat prospered like never before. Frank, recognizing that he could no longer maintain anonymity, decided to expand his business, hiring local young people whom he taught the art of traditional baking. His bread became so famous that tourists from all over the world lined up each morning to try it. One afternoon, while supervising his apprentices, Frank received an unexpected visit. Eddie Carson, who had served a brief sentence for his participation in the extortions, was at the door, visibly nervous. "Mr. Davidson," he greeted, unsure of his reception, "I came to thank you. The judge said your testimony was key for my reduced sentence." Frank observed him for a moment before responding. "Everyone deserves a second chance, Eddie. The question is, what will you do with yours?" That's part of why I'm here," replied the young man. "I need work, and I thought, well, I always liked bread." With a smile that reflected his philosophy of life, Frank handed him an apron. "The first lesson is that good bread, like a good life, requires patience, attention to detail, and clean hands. Let's start there." And so, in the heart of Riverdale, a former Special Forces commander continued his most important mission, creating something that nourished both the body and soul of his community. His past would remain part of him, a skill that could be activated when necessary to protect what he loved, but his present and future belonged to the bakery, to flour and sugar, to the peace he had found among the aroma of freshly baked bread. Dear listeners, we hope that the story of Frank Davidson, the baker with an extraordinary past, has moved you. To continue this emotional journey, we have prepared a special playlist with equally captivating stories about second chances and transformed lives. Find it here by clicking to your left. If you like this narrative, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like the video. Every day we bring unique stories that explore human complexity and the power of reinvention. Like the bread that Frank needed each morning, our stories are made with dedication and passion to nourish your imagination. What do you think about Frank's decision to abandon his military life for baking? Do you believe that true heroism can be found in everyday actions? We await you in the comments to know your thoughts. Don't miss our upcoming content. Just like the customers of Golden Wheat, we promise that each visit to our channel will be worth it. Until the next story.